Welcome to the first Cure Kids Big Research for Little Lives podcast series. My name is Brendan Pongia and I'm your host today. This podcast is proudly brought to you by Partners Life, who share Cure Kids' vision of healthier children with a brighter future. Today we meet Dr. Andy Wood, a haematologist and oncologist from the University of Auckland. Andy's worked at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, one of the world's leading child cancer hospitals, prior to returning to New Zealand to work on a new and bold research project funded by Cure Kids, the Child Cancer Foundation and the Lindsay Foundation. We'll also be joined by 5-year-old Luca and hear from her mother Jordana, who will share their incredible journey from finding out that Luca had a rare form of cancer at 16 months and is now cancer-free thanks to precision medicine. Well, we're thrilled to have Dr. Andy Wood on our first edition of this podcast to speak to us about how he's using precision medicine and to find targeted therapies to help children in New Zealand with cancer. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Andy, let's go back. Let's go back to when you were a kid. Where did you grow up?
In Wellington.
And so, how did your life? What did it look like growing up? Did you come from a big family?
Smaller family. There was sort of four of us. My sister and I grew up loving the bays around Wellington. Loved the outdoors around Wellington, the valleys and the rivers and the bays and the tops of the hills. And I think that sort of triggered my interest in biology. What were you like as a child? Were you cheeky? Oh, probably quite nerdy and quiet, but also liked sport.
So you moved from Wellington. When did you decide to head down this path?
End of school was trying to find something that was a combination of people and science, and medicine was an obvious fit. It was also an excuse to leave Wellington. And Auckland was a big city. It was up north. It was a bit warmer and looked pretty appealing to me.
So you spent a number of years in Auckland. When did the opportunity arise for you to head over to America?
During my paediatric training, you sort of rotate through all the different parts of paediatrics. And, you know, when I rotated through paediatric cancer and blood, you know, it was a very compelling experience. And once I decided that that was the specialty I wanted to pursue, I had a chat to the consultants who were there and about, you know, what their thoughts were. And one of the consultants was close friends with a woman who was really the queen mother of paediatric oncology, someone who had been there since the inception of the field, an absolute world leader in every sense of the word. And he said, I think you need to go and work with her. Right. Heading to America, did you have any regrets leaving New Zealand, or did you feel was the path for you to progress in your field? I was always pretty certain I'd spend some time living out of New Zealand. I'd always enjoyed travelling, always enjoyed seeing new places, always enjoyed the context that living somewhere else gives you. And so moving overseas was actually pretty exciting for me. There's lots of things about the States that I love, the energy and the optimism and the can-do attitude there. And so, you know, as we were heading there, I was super looking forward to it. So moving to the States, did you have a family at the time, or did you have the family while you were over there? So at the time we just moved there, it was my wife and I. We had our 3 kids there. They're all dual citizens. They've all got these very full-on US passports. We are the people, birthplace of democracy. It's quite a contrast to the humble Kiwi passport. So you know, our family started here but grew there. So how was it for you working in the States, you know, bringing up a young family? Obviously a lot of support from the wife. Huge amount of support. Sarah was undoubtedly a hero in the process. The American work ethic is infamous, and Sarah certainly carried a lot of the load when the kids were young. And at the same time, you know, the Americans have, you know, a lot of places there's a great sense of welcoming and community. And so we also had a network of friends who were also, you know, super supportive and great company. So while you were over there working, did you still connect a lot back with a lot of your former workers here in New Zealand to see what was going on over here? Always. It's, I think now it's so easy to stay in touch, and never really left contact really. The plan was always to come back home. And so that was always, the goalpost was always really clear for us, professionally and personally, and we're always going to come home. And so we always kept an eye, and then we also were coming back for holidays to see family and friends and the land, and then also seeing folks at conferences. So I always felt pretty in tune to what was happening here.
When did you know it was the right time to leave the US? I can imagine you were deeply involved with a lot of the work that you were doing. Had you finished all those current projects that you'd been working on, and was there a natural transition to come home?
The decision to come home was both incredibly easy and really hard. The opportunity in the States professionally is unrivaled. It's incredibly stimulating. You get to work with people who are literally leading something in the world, and these amazing people and all this energy, and so that side of it was really hard. On the same note, we had 3 kids, and home is home.
I want to talk about the funding model in the US, because I know philanthropy is a huge, is a very big thing that happens over in the US. Did you have that funding? Did you have a lot of money to be able to work with a lot of the projects that you were working on?
Yeah, so I had a mix of funding. So actually getting to the States, the foundation funding I had was actually a Fulbright scholarship, but then I actually got 3 other grants to help me from New Zealand charities and funders as well. And so the philanthropy for me was a critical kickstart to even getting into the US. And then in the US, they have a massive government funding for science and a massive, philanthropic funding. And the philanthropic funding is also really sophisticated. And the funding there, what it builds is actually incredible, because a lot of the children's hospital there was built using philanthropic funding.
Right.
And the research is done with philanthropic funding. And there's a lot of endowments that fund salaries and roles and jobs and positions in perpetuity. And so the whole physical and intellectual infrastructure in many ways was built on philanthropy for this world-leading children's cancer centre.
So you have the opportunity to come back to New Zealand. How did that come about, and what are you doing currently here now?
So we were working out what we're going to do post-States, looking at coming home. And, the funding situation in New Zealand is challenging compared to other parts of the world for science. And it was a challenge to find adequate funding to do any work.
Why is that?
That's a great question. I think the obvious one is we are smaller. I think we have a relatively lower GDP to some other countries. And I also don't think we have a tradition of valuing science. I don't think, like in the States, you'd meet people and they'd go, we should be curing cancer. We should be funding this to happen. We should be doing this. And in New Zealand, there's almost a different attitude of, we should be letting someone else be doing that and, riding the coattails.
So in terms of, precision medicine for children and adolescents with cancer, where do we rate in terms of New Zealand and what we're doing and some of the work that you're involved with?
So it's a mix. So the vast majority of children that we treat on protocols that are used right now in other parts of the world, mostly the US.
Right.
And so most of the kids we would treat would be on protocols that are used in the best hospitals in the States. And for some of our protocols, the best hospitals in Europe. And those protocols incorporate aspects of precision medicine to varying degrees. But when you actually get kids for whom that first line of treatment is failing, and you've got to look to your plan B, plan C, or plan D, that's where New Zealand kids don't have access to the same trials. So while we have lots of stuff open for first line treatment that's truly cutting edge, we have a lot less that our families can access if that first line therapy doesn't work. And I think that's where precision medicine has more of a role.
So Andy, tell us about the importance of Cure Kids and child cancer, because when you look at it from a Cure Kids perspective, it's our largest project that we've funded, which we're very, very proud of. But yeah, the importance of both those organisations.
So the first introduction for me to Cure Kids was actually getting the funding for us to get back from the States to New Zealand. So when we were over there looking for opportunities to come back and we had a project to fund, I was talking to people back home saying, well, how do I get this off the ground? And someone said to me, well, there's this organisation, Cure Kids, so you should talk to them because they make things happen. So, that started a conversation that actually got the funding that got me back to New Zealand, which was, fantastic. Made my wife and my mum pretty happy. And then the relationships really continued from there. And the other key thing to say is that, Child Cancer Foundation's also been critical in that, early repatriation back home. For this project, we had talked with Cure Kids and Child Cancer Foundation about ambitions for what we thought child cancer care and child cancer research in New Zealand could look like or should look like. And we had talked about the opportunity to, that precision medicine represented. And, I think it's quite a compelling story. And so Cure Kids and Child Cancer Foundation have both been superb in actually working with me and encouraging me to, be ambitious with this project and actually to try and really find, a research project that wasn't compromising.
So tell us about the original project, and I guess it was 1.25 million that
exactly.
you originally had, and then obviously it moved to 2.75. What did it look like initially, and then how did it, and what did that extra 1.5 help to advance?
So the initial project was looking at a smaller number of genes, under 200 genes, and it was looking at them in quite a narrow set of circumstances, which was pretty much focused on if cancer therapy wasn't working. And the project now, looks different. And part of the reason is things have moved, and we've tried to move with them. So instead of looking at a couple of hundred genes, we're now going to have a cancer panel that can look at over 500 genes for some cases, and for other cases we'll look, which is about 2 million letters of DNA, and for other cases we'll look at 6 billion, billion with a B letters of DNA, which is the entire human genome. And so what that gives us the ability to do is, for any given case, is to try and give them the best tests we can. But the role of the testing's also expanded because of the extra funding, what this lets us do. So the initial funding was mostly focused on these difficult to treat cases, and that's still our primary focus.
Right.
But one of the things that's happened in cancer is we keep subdividing things into smaller bits. Something that used to be a big block, we now see as 3 subtypes. And then we've divided one subtype into 2 more subtypes. And that often involves a lot of genetics. And so one of the things we actually need this is actually to help us make the right diagnosis of subtype, which is increasingly important. And then sometimes you want to diagnose a cancer and it just doesn't fall into the traditional boxes. And one of the big findings that people have found overseas with doing whole genomes is that when you have these cases that are tricky to put into a diagnostic category, when you sequence all 6 billion letters of DNA, sometimes the information you get is really helpful to actually say this is actually the best fit, because now we think that's the best fit. Now it's going to point us in this direction. So now we think your diagnosis is this, the prognosis as best we know is this, and the treatment options we can offer you are this. And so I think the project now in this expanded form with these generous donations, it's about diagnosis and it's about difficult to treat cancers for appropriate cases.
Well, and I think initially when we saw what was happening in that at the start of the project, and with Cure Kids managing to get the likes of the Lindsay Foundation on board to enable an opportunity from CCF to join that, hugely beneficial to be able to continue and grow the project.
Oh, the donation from the Lindsay Foundation is massive. And, I think one of the things that an organisation like Cure Kids can do and that we can do is try and amplify these things into opportunity. And so, this extra money also lets us do more stuff here, but also lets us collaborate with, a group in Sydney who are collaborating with other folks overseas, and for this particular thing doing a really superb job of it. And so that sort of brings not just me into that orbit, but it brings people in the research team into that orbit. And, So I think the effects of these donations, they tend to amplify, is my experience.
Well, and when you look at it, I think it's quite a unique thing, two charities working together, on a specific project and actually coming to an understanding of, actually, you know what, we can come this far, you can bring what you need to bring to it, and we can together be able to do amazing things. And I think what it shows is that maybe we can collaborate with other charities when looking at doing certain projects.
That's been one of the things for me that's been critical to have Cure Kids and CCF as partners, is, the reality is that research is really expensive. And it's actually a little bit more expensive in New Zealand, but it's really critical that we do it here. And it's just often the case that one charity might not have enough money to make things happen. And so you've sometimes got to combine funds and tag team. And then the other thing that happens is sometimes when you get these different charities, you can get these synergies and you can get visions and you can get strategic thinking that helps too. And so the input's not necessarily one that's passive, but it can also help with thinking about long-term strategy and, where am I in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Where do we want our capacity to be?
So with this Precision Paediatric Cancer Project, it's a real mouthful.
Yeah.
Is it for everyone in New Zealand? We spoke earlier around, you've got a centre in Christchurch, is that correct?
Absolutely. So in New Zealand, there are 2 specialist child cancer treatment centres. One centre is in Auckland and one centre is in Christchurch. And between both centres, we treat every child in New Zealand with cancer. So the children will go to one of those 2 centres to get parts of their care. And if they live in Auckland, they'll obviously stay in Auckland. But say a family lived in Hastings, they might have some of their therapy in Auckland, then go back to Hastings. And then there's a team of doctors and nurses that help look after them in Hastings. And so we have a national system to treat cancer and treat everyone really well, but there's 2 specialist treatment centres. So any child that's treated at either centre can access this trial, which is based in Christchurch and Auckland, and a critical part of the team is in Christchurch. And because of that, that's really important to us because we want this trial to be accessible to any child. We're offering the trial as appropriate.
So your long-term vision for the project?
The long-term vision would be that by the time we are sort of completed this, that we have helped a whole lot of children get the best diagnosis of subtype, that we have found some treatment opportunities for children that would have otherwise been missed, and that in the cases where unfortunately we don't find a treatment opportunity, that those parents can take some solace that we left no stone unturned, and also that people can access that sort of very high-end research assay, regardless of how much personal wealth they have. We want this to be accessible to every child.
Well, I think what we're doing right now is an opportunity to be accessible to New Zealand and people to actually understand the project and the work that you're doing, which I think is hugely important.
Yeah, no, and we appreciate the opportunity. I think it's always important for people that are, doing science to try and actually speak to the community about what we're doing.
And how's the response been so far here in New Zealand?
Well, so far we're still sort of looking at rolling the trial out, and the challenge we've had is that the scope of DNA letters that we understand has just grown exponentially.
Right.
And that's why the extra funding became so incredible, because initially we wanted to look at a certain number of genes and a certain number of DNA letters, and then we realized that wasn't going to be very adequate. What we thought was a good idea in 2017 was not adequate for 2020. And what the extra funding's done, which is amazing, is given us the ability in some cases to look at all 6 billion letters of DNA. So, that means we're not going to leave a stone unturned.
And the process is a lot less evasive for the children as well?
It actually varies. You still need to do that sequencing of the cancer tissue, and so you've got to get that cancer tissue somehow. That's either from a biopsy or from surgery generally. In parallel, we're going to look at exploring something where you can study mutations from a blood test, but the role of using blood tests as a surrogate, I think that's still unclear in paediatrics.
And the impact that what you'd like to see in the next 3 to 5 years? What's the I guess there's never an end, I know that, but what's the golden, what does it look like?
So to me, it looks like that any child in New Zealand, no matter who you are or where you're from, can access the best technology in the world to scan their tumour DNA and look to see if there's a new treatment opportunity. And then we have a national approach to reviewing all the spelling mistakes, and we have the ability to then work out which therapies could be then offered to a family that might be helpful.
How big a team do you have that work with you?
Well, the team is actually huge in the sense that, modern healthcare, you need really big, complex teams. So at the hospital, for a start, we've got a really big, complex team of doctors, and doctors across all different specialities are critical. And then we've got a fantastic nursing, pharmacology and psychology teams, social work teams, and then NGOs supporting families. So they're actually critical. And then at the university side, we have a smaller team, but we're also working with folks in Sydney who have actually established a sort of world-class pipeline in Australia to look at these things.
I was going to ask that, how important, your work in the US,
Yeah.
how often do you talk to your former work colleagues over there about what you're doing and where you're up to, and how important is some of the knowledge that they have and sharing it with you?
It's critical, really, because emailing people is just not the same as
No.
a chat. But it's I think Zoom, the new Zoom culture with COVID's really helped too. But I would be on the phone on a Zoom chat with someone in the States, probably once every 2 weeks or so, usually at very inopportune hours in the early morning. But quite a few chats, and so that helps me to feel that I know what US practice is trending towards, and it helps me to feel that we can calibrate the service that we offer to families in New Zealand.
Speaking of families in New Zealand, which is a great
Yeah.
segue, we're going to talk to Jordana and Luca in a little bit. Luca being 5 years old. Tell us a little bit about the story of how you met Jordana and Luca and what's happened since then. And once you've sort of explained that, I'll get them to come in and we'll talk to them as well.
Yeah, so the very first time I, came across their story, I was sitting in a very large lecture theatre and we were discussing all the cases. And this case was, put on the screens to review the radiology. And I remember looking at the radiology and going, wow, that is a scary looking tumour.
Right.
And then we finished one of the conferences and one of the surgeons and I went to go down and meet the family. And so that, the first time I met this family, they were really in crisis.
You talked about the tumour. It was quite a unique tumour. It's something that's quite rare. Is that correct?
It is rare. At the time that we first met Luca, there was 9 cases described in the world.
Wow.
And 8 of those children had not survived. And so, when you meet a family and they start asking you questions about the tumour and you start talking about things, that's a pretty horrific set of numbers to share with people that you've just met. When you go through medical training, there's a lot of great role models of people who manage that, professional model of care. And, it's essentially, it's a service that's ultimately driven by love, but it comes through a very professional model.
Right.
And
Still
so
hard though.
It is hard.
Yeah.
I mean, look, there are days when, I come home from work and the kids get an extra long hug and then they're kind of finished with the hug and want to run off and I'm not finished yet.
Yeah.
So there are undoubtedly some incredibly great moments at work, and there are some very, very brutal, hard moments too. And being a dad, you realise that the kids are the closest thing to your heart, and that you'll do everything for them. And you certainly, I think it's easy to see that in other parents when they hit this situation.
Before we get Jordana and Luca to come in, how do you have a full-on role of what you do? It's very, very rewarding. You have a situation like Jordana and Luca. What do you do to step away from all those things and actually relax and have some of your own time?
Having 3 kids at home is like standing under a waterfall. It's like an all-consuming sensation. Like even if you wanted to think about work, you couldn't because there's so much going on. And then, family and friends. nothing special in that regard.
Yeah.
I enjoy a good meal. I enjoy a nice drink. I enjoy getting out on the water. I enjoy the hills.
Well, I imagine it's important. It's important for all of us, to have that space and time to be able to just be,
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And that stuff that you enjoy yourself and that you enjoy so much is part of the reason that you try and do for families what you do, because you know what families are and you know what families enjoy, and you want these other families to have their moments and to do what's important to them.
All right, we're going to get Jordana and Luca to come in, and we're going to have a chat to them. Come in and take a seat. Lovely to have you here.
Hi. You alright?
Jordana, thank you so much. Luca, thank you. Lovely. You're looking very pretty there today. Liking the hair clip. Is it good to see Andy? No, maybe not. Maybe. Jordana, talk to us about how you met Andy and I guess the journey that you guys have been on.
Yeah, I've got to think back now, but we met Andy for the first time basically when I was gathered in a room with all my family to hear what the diagnosis was of Luca's tumour, and it was a pretty raw moment. We'd met with the surgeon, Mr. Steve Evans, and he had sort of said, well, this is what we've found. It's a very unusual tumour, and this is why it's taken us a little while to diagnose it. And that basically there were only a handful of cases in the world at that time. Prognosis wasn't fantastic because they'd tried traditional treatments, chemotherapy and things, and I think the information that I got given was that there'd been 9 cases in the world, and I think 8 of them were no longer alive.
Right.
Because traditional treatments hadn't worked. And so he kind of had delivered that news and talked about it, and then Andy had said, Andy's going to come down, Dr. Wood, and he'll talk to you a bit more. And so Andy came in, and I can remember saying at that point that I didn't want to put her through any sort of treatment. If there was no evidence that it was going to work, I didn't want to put her through with them because she was 16 months old, and it's like, what's the point in prolonging suffering? And so, and I remember starting to cry at that point, as it just felt like my worst case scenario had unfolded. That didn't know, it was the worst possible type of tumour, and it was the worst possible prognosis. And I basically thought they were telling me, she's going to die, and we're going to have to let her die, essentially.
Right.
But they were sort of trying to deliver it. I mean, because I'm a teacher, it's like writing reports, you put things in a different way, and so I was reading between the lines that it felt like, we can try operate, or we might be able to, but realistically, that's the evidence. So I sort of said that Andy, the first thing he did to me was give me a tissue to stop me crying, which I'll never forget because it was just such a lovely gesture.
Yeah.
In that moment, to walk across the room, and then the other thing that really impressed me was he said, where is Luca? I want to meet Luca, because obviously he'd heard about her and discussing the case and things, but hadn't actually met her, and she wasn't in the room at the time because she was too little, and so we could communicate. And so then I walked out with Andy to find her because my mother-in-law was looking after her in a pram, and he said to me, don't lose hope at this point, you shouldn't lose hope right now, and something along those lines. And the way he said it and the mannerism that he had, I just felt he knew something that I didn't know, or I just trusted that there was something that he thought could potentially help her. And I think it was that afternoon, I think they were waiting for test results of what type of, what do we call that cell? What type of...
The exact type of cancer?
Yeah, that she had, and whether it would be therefore, I think he knew that there had been this treatment overseas, that it might be possible to try a new drug if she had the right genetic makeup for it. And then I think he came back up onto ward that evening and said, yep, she does have that, so we're going to try this. And it was like, finally, like a little bit of hope, and pretty much the worst day of my life.
Well,
ever.
So scary for you, and then having someone that you hadn't met before walk into the room, and then you feel that comfortable
Yeah.
with the way that he presented himself and
Yeah.
was probably more than but just being a doctor, actually caring about you guys because he's a father
Yes.
himself.
Yes. And I think the other key thing that I noticed, what set him apart perhaps to some other people, that I've always felt like with Andy, he's on a mission, and you very much get that sense that he's, sorry Andy, but it's a bit cheesy, but it is a bit like you've got an intense focus and a real drive and a goal, and that just came through in that moment, that it wasn't that, so I'm not giving up, I'm going to try to fix your daughter. And that was just so reassuring, at that moment.
What about, besides Andy, where were you getting your other support from during this time? Because I'd hate to imagine what it was like.
So obviously our families all live in Auckland, so we were very lucky to have grandparents involved. And obviously friends were dropping off staff, people we worked with, colleagues, all sorts of things were helping us while we were, because then we were in hospital having the operation soon after that. So we were quite lucky. We got a lot of support from those places, and we're also lucky that we had connections with some people in the States, and we appealed to them and said, is there any treatment over there, or who should we be dealing with, and they basically came back and said 2 people, I think, in New Zealand, and one of them was Andy. So that was reassuring for us to know that, because obviously we've never thought about oncology or about these things before, that who we were dealing with was in touch with what was happening in the world and was up there with kind of the best.
Did you find yourself becoming a researcher and actually finding everything and everything out? Yeah.
And I still am. I'll still look for stuff online, read medical articles, ask Andy if there's anything, he'll send through things if he comes across anything. But at the time, again, it was so rare that it was a pretty grim reading.
Yeah.
And there weren't a lot of studies. I sort of could only go back to the one study. And you always wondered what happened to the one person who stayed alive, But yeah.
So for you, Andy, how much is too much information when you've got a situation like this? It's a rare disease. You don't want to overload them with too much information, or you just give them the basic facts as information arises. You give them.
Yeah. So every family is different. Some families want more information. Some families want less. Some families want to know every bit of information down to, percents and the point of a percent. And, other families you get a sense of as you talk, you sort of deliver the key messages first, and sometimes you just get a sense that now's enough.
Yeah.
And then you don't need to do everything in one conversation. You're at the start of a long process. And, when you meet a family, you don't know what is going to happen to that child. You've got other... you've had other experiences in the field and you've seen other kids, but you don't know what's going to unfold for that family. And you sort of, in your mind, you meet them and you have a sense of all the scenarios. And most of them were unhappy scenarios. And, when we had that first, the first exact histology of what this was. And, I think with your family, it was evident from the start, you're a big group who were working as a tag team. And that's also a really comforting thing, because you know that you're about to start a marathon.
Yeah.
And I guess when you look at the project, the Precision Paediatric Cancer Project, how's it impacted you guys as a family?
Oh, A, it's kept her alive. B, her quality of life has been pretty amazing. She's had really, when she was on the drug, she had so few side effects. She's been able to live a normal life. She seems like she's developed normally.
How are you feeling right now? You good? You happy?
Yeah.
Yeah, she's just
a little bit
shy.
nervous.
She's just a bit shy. Yeah. But no, she's doing gymnastics. She is living the dream, I kind of feel.
So this project that Andy's involved with, very successful in your eyes, but obviously there's still a lot more work that Andy's trying to do, and the importance of that work. You highly recommend it? Yeah,
well, when we were waiting for the diagnosis and we knew it was a tumour, I remember Mr. Steve Evans saying, the good thing is with child cancers is we tend to, there's a couple of major ones, and we tend to, they tend to have good life expectancy, and once we know what it is and we know, boom, it's that one, you're down a very clear path with clear results and clear kind of outcomes. And so, of course, when we find out, well, no, it's not a typical child cancer, it's a more unusual one, type of cancer, and it doesn't respond, and we can't give you any information or any statistics really other than this one study. It's just like, I mean, finding out that your kid, I remember like because I found it about 4 a.m. or something, the radiologist who'd been in ER thought she had other things wrong, and then he did a scan of tummy, massive tumour. So they said to me, you know, this is the beginning of a long journey. Well, at 4 a.m. in the morning, when you think your daughter's just had something minor and you've never even considered cancer, that was an incredible thing to be told. And then you were sort of, you know, shoved back to a ward, to a bed with, I think there was a room with about 5 other people, and I just started crying because I was just like, what is going on? So just, I think to go from that, and then you kind of look at the information, you go, well, no, it's probably a child cancer, and they tell you, well, if it is, it's actually high chance of survival, this is how we treat it, boom, 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 it's all step by step, you'll be fine. You sort of get your head around that in the next week, maybe, when you're waiting for results. And then when you wait for your results, you get your head around that, okay, it could be cancer, that's horrific, but we'll deal with it. And then it was like, well, it's this type, and this whole scenario, everything's gone up. It was sort of like, again, you're another blow. And yet since then, because of what Andy has known, the treatments that she's had access to, it's been like, it was like worst case scenario, and then it's been like best since then. So it's been a complete, you know,
do you feel you guys
direction.
have changed it as a family just through going through this journey?
Oh, yeah, completely.
In what ways?
And as a person. I think just in being aware of how quickly your life can change, of what your priorities are, of trying to live day to day. Obviously with her, we're still having scans every few months, and we don't know. She's sort of still leading the way in terms of, you know, expectations of outcomes. So, yeah, it has really, truly, changed our lives completely.
I mean, if there are people that are watching, and there will be people watching this podcast throughout the country, and if there are people that are thinking of donating on a project like this, what would you say? What would you say to them?
I just honestly don't think there's a more worthy cause, because to see, I mean, we all know the moment you become a mother or a father, it's completely different. To see your child suffer is just incredibly, or to lose your child, and to know that there is a way potentially out there, but you just don't have access to it, or whatever, whether it's drugs or research, it would be absolutely soul destroying. So I just can't think of a more worthy cause, honestly. I'm so grateful every day.
When you hear that story, I mean, how does it make you feel?
It's an incredible story. I mean, it's to be honest, when you've got these incredibly tricky situations, it's not every time that the stars aligned,
No,
like they have with Luca, and they truly have. That, you know, she was on that very cusp of the cutting edge when, you know, one other child in the world had you know, that medication for that disease, and the, you know, the experience was pretty short, and there were some differences too. So, you know, I think it's an incredible story, and I think, you know, the reality is that most times you get to a situation where something is incredibly hard to treat. Most times precision medicine may offer some time with quality of life, but most times it's not necessarily going to cause that child to be alive as a healthy adult in the future. We just don't know. You know, the field is so early, we don't really understand the long-term outcomes, but, you know, I think with Luca, it was, you know, just it's been spectacular. You know, watching her thrive. And my favourite photo of Luca is actually the one with Harrison, and she's her little brother, and she's cuddling him, and it's more like a stranglehold, but it's a loving stranglehold, because that's a normal brother and sister, and the cancer's irrelevant. At that moment. And that's the favourite outcome, right? Is like the best outcome is when you treat a child, you're very involved with them, and they come back healthy, and they don't remember who you are. You know, they're not even traumatised by the experience so much, because so much of it is past. And so, you know, for me, that photo encapsulates
All of that.
So, so many parts of the story
Yeah.
of Luca and the family and the pieces of the puzzle.
Jordana, thank you so much for joining us today. Luca,
No worries.
we're so lucky to have you here. We really are. I think we've got big things to look forward to with you growing up and getting older. You're a miracle, and we really, really appreciate it. Andy, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
on the first
Thank you for having
podcast.
me.
I'm sure everyone at home has enjoyed it, and thank you again. Thanks for listening. This podcast is proudly brought to you by Partners Life, who share Cure Kids' vision of healthier children with a brighter future. Look out for the next podcast in the series coming soon. Remember to subscribe to this series to be alerted when a new podcast is available. And you can donate to this worthy cause by visiting the Cure Kids website at www.curekids.org.nz.